Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Privacy Conversations. Justin Antonipillai and I are joined by a really fascinating and wonderful guest. And I'll kick it over to Justin to introduce him, and then we'll get started on our conversation.
Great to see everybody again. As I've mentioned on our prior sessions, Dan and I have been incredibly humbled and proud about the number of folks who have been joining in these privacy conversations we've been having, and the numbers continue to grow. We're really committed to continue to bring phenomenal leaders in various fields to the privacy community to talk about hard issues and upcoming things, both from the technology front and the policy front and the legal front. And in that spirit, I'm really excited to introduce my friend and our partner here at Wirewheel, Igor Jablokov, who is the founder and CEO of Prion. And in his prior life, actually built the company whose technology became the basis for Alexa, which is now, part of the world vernacular. And you can say what an Alexa function is, and people know what it is. Even I know what it is, Igor. So it's got to be amazing to have founded something that turned into a word that almost everybody knows. So for today's conversation, we're obviously going to focus on issues around machine learning, AI, neural networks. But before we dive, and the crossroads with data protection and privacy and what's going on with human beings around the world, that'll be our focus today. But before we get started, we always just like to ask our guests to talk a little bit about, how did you get here? How did you start? What's your background? And how did you build, first the company that became Alexa to start? I'm sure you get asked this all the time, but let's start there, and then we can talk about what you're doing with Prion.
Yeah, so funny enough, I was running the multimodal research team at IBM, and that's when we first had an inclination to say, holy smokes, AI assistants are going to be this big deal, and in order for you to have natural language access to everything, right, in enterprise, at home, and what have you. And it really didn't find its footing there, because IBM is not an entity known for creating finished consumable products. It prefers to work on fundamental technologies and more inside of the middleware stack. And so I ended up departing, built a venture-backed company. And we were at the first ever TechCrunch Disrupt conference in 2007. And I held baby Alexa on a Razr flip phone at the time. And I said, look, I wanted to ask any question that would ever pop in my head, like, why is the sky blue, and get an answer back in 1 second. And then crickets. Everybody's like, why would you need that? What would be the business case for it? How do you what are the different channels for deploying it? Because remember, this is before the iPhone, before app stores, before 3G networks, before all of these things. So it was ahead of its time in many ways. And so what we ended up doing is, because we had to develop a cloud-based version of speech recognition in order to make this thing cost efficient, what ended up happening is, instead, many companies, dozens of enterprise and carrier customers, started leveraging our AI cloud for processing phone calls, for processing voicemails, for processing messages, for processing searches. And so we had tens of millions of unique voices that ended up getting captured by this platform. And then behind the scenes, though, we were always tending to this AI assistant. Behind the scenes, we were even working with Apple before they acquired the Siri team on what it would look like on this next gen platform. So we ended up being Amazon's first ever AI related acquisition, and everything went radio silent. We just disappeared, and then 3 to 4 years later, I believe the world was introduced to the Amazon Echo, the Fire phone, the Fire TV, all of these things were backstopped by our engine that was codenamed Prion. So long story short, we ended up reusing that name for this company. But when we started seeing consumer incarnations of these AI assistants, we felt like it was time to address the enterprise workloads that could benefit from this type of interaction method. And that's why this company was formed.
Well, look, and I just have to ask, like, when did you know that this nugget that you were ahead of the market on and ahead of the world? When did you get an inkling that it was going to be this big? And I mean, you got to be proud about that, right? Fundamentally, I mean, it's just a thing to have created something that built that way. It's got to be a point of pride.
Sure, but I felt like the Unabomber, you know, telling people something was coming and everybody disbelieving it, right? The Cassandra, 2003, Justin. That's when I was sure that this thing would be a blowout. You know, in a 2005 Popular Mechanics article, I was quoted, "Why do we have remote controls? I can talk to this television. I can talk to set-top boxes and pull content out and what have you." So 2003. So it took over a decade until somebody was able to take these ideas at a scale where you know, a multitude of people can use it. Obviously, Siri, you know, came out sooner than the Amazon Echo. That was just essentially a great hardware packaging for that technology. But even the AI assistant, see, until Siri came out, people didn't know how to describe it at all. Just like, you know, for any of us that worked in early cloud, we talked about client server computing and things of that sort. But once the media took off and started calling it cloud computing, it was a lot easier for us to describe the things that we do. In many cases, our current companies, it's hard sometimes to pitch and describe what we do, but sooner or later it'll find its mass market approximation, and then people will really get what we do.
No, I get it. And look, when you're founding a company, you're sometimes ahead, and there's a particular kind of person that's going to stand out and keep pushing it forward. You know, anybody who's founded a company knows there's a quote that I read every once in a while, and I think it's about right. You know, founding a company is like standing on the edge of an abyss, chewing glass. You know, you get to the point where now people are talking about what you did, and it's an absolutely amazing thing. But there are years where you're trying to get there, and I imagine you have some really interesting stories about that journey in between. So I'll ask you two quick questions before we pivot over to the technology. And if you want to think about this and come back, totally fine. Mm-hmm. One of them is, what's a cool thing that we can do on Alexa, like just by asking it, or with any of these voice, you know, kind of assisted technologies? What's something that a lot of us don't know we can do that you do, I assume, because you know how to use these things? So answer that. But or where there's some moments where in the 10 years between when you were out there ahead of the market, where you were able to keep it moving in the face of resistance, you know, like either one of those.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, maybe this is biased towards why some people, you know, found these companies in the first place. I focus more on the things that it can't do than the things that it can do. I mean, I'm surprised at the questions that I asked that where I can't get a proper answer. Now I know architecturally behind the scenes why it's not answering me, and for me, it's about working with an R&D team to figure out, you know, how to solve that. So for instance, yesterday I was trying to figure out when was the Cray 1 supercomputer released, and it kept misunderstanding me, thinking that I was asking about Cree, the light bulb company, and that's headquartered in Durham, North Carolina. And so for me, that's just me jotting down notes to say, all right, how do we fix that? You know, in it not working in the new architecture going forward. And look, I'll say this, admittedly, it's even hard for me to set up some of the smartphone, smart home skills and things of that sort. I talk to it, and light bulbs don't turn on, you know, when I want them to, right? Or that, you know, what I consider is AI English is like a new form of English, and the way that I describe the command and control process in Siri, in Google Assistant, in Alexa, in many ways. And we see this in children fumbling and trying to use these platforms. it's essentially a verbal DOS command. Like those command prompts that we used to use in the past pre-Windows. That's what we do with these things, but they're going to get better. Especially with edge processing, especially with sensor fusion, when they can start using some of these cameras. But that's a layup. I'm describing to you how these things can be solved, but they present privacy issues
Now,
when we talk about sensor
now
fusion.
I don't know. I'll move on right away, but I will say my kids mock me pretty regularly because when I'm trying to address one of the wake functions, I start talking like the thing that talks back to me. I'll say,
Right.
I'll follow the same cadence as though we're in a conversation, but like I've somehow speaking like with an Alexa accent or something. They're like, you don't talk like that at all. Why in the world did you just say, call mom, using the same verbal cues that this thing just talked to you? You look like you're learning a new language. So like, I totally get it, but it's just a thing. You should know you're effectively teaching us to speak Jablokov right now, right? We're all speaking Jablokov. So, but let me pivot for a moment. And let me ask, because one of the things that I just want to make sure for our community, this can be brief. Give us a verbal way to think about three concepts, Igor, and then maybe I'll pivot over to Dan. So just so we're using the same language: machine learning, AI, neural networks. Just in something that you would explain to a kid, how do you think about those three concepts?
All right. So AI is how the media describes what we do, and machine learning is what we actually do. Right. So AI is something that's been, on vogue here in the last, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. But practitioners didn't talk about AI because the type of AI that we all remember from, reading science fiction, whether it's Asimov or otherwise, is something that's a bit more encompassing and a bit more organic and a bit more capable than the things that we have where, light bulbs don't go on and off when we ask them to. And so AI is more of a marketing term than anything else. And machine learning is just as transactions come through, the computer is going to be using observations of the output, whether people liked it or not, and folding those back into it and learning from that use. Are people giving thumbs up or thumbs down? All of you, as you've used Alexa and similar systems, have probably heard her ask once in a while, hey, were you happy with the result or not? And then whether you said yes or no, and not many of you have to answer the question. And some of you are maybe bugged by the fact that she asked you. But if she asks enough people to in this massive deployment that they have, it's statistically significant enough where certain levers and things like that and weights inside of the system will change based on that feedback that's coming that may just be verbal. In some ways, you have visual cues, right? So as you're getting things back from Google or Facebook and everything else, and you're giving thumbs up and thumbs down to certain things, guess what? Those things feed into an unsupervised learning process, or it could be semi-supervised, where there's certain people reviewing the feedback that's coming back, and that's how these things get smarter. And a way to approximate it for the layperson, by the way, is imagine this. All of us are starting a new job. We're getting paid a certain salary on day one of our job. 365 days later, we're getting paid the same salary. What's the difference between us on day one and us on day 365? Well, we've had organic learning. We know who the subject matter experts are for these different things. We know where all the files are stored. We know where this is. We know our customers, our partners. We know how to answer certain concerns. We know how to deal with customer requests and partner requests. We have gone through a learning process for the tasks that are assigned to us. And that's exactly what AI goes through, or what this type of software goes through, that has cognitive ability. That's a mechanized version of the same learning process.
And when we talk about the neural networks, that's how do you think about that part of it?
Yeah, so it's just a point in time, a type of technology. It's a type of way of doing these things. In the past, we had feature engineering and hidden Markov models as a way of essentially creating a model for, hey, If I need you to separate pictures of dogs and cats, I need to tell you the type of fur that they have, the coloring that they have, how their ears are pointy or not, their snouts, whiskers and things like that. And I have to do the features, right? And create these different models. And then I run the pictures through one of these models, and it gives me a confidence score of accept or reject whether the picture is of a dog. And then I run the cat pictures through the dog model, and it'll give me a confidence score whether it's a picture of a dog or not. With neural networks, it's the next thing that happened that basically says, look, just dump all the pictures in there, and it can do some clustering to tell you, here's all the different clusters that we've seen. And now when you go in after the fact and inspect it, you can say, all right, all the pictures that have had black animals are there, the white animals are there, the brown animals are there, the ones that had 4 legs are all of them. It should be all of them. All the different types of snouts, all the different types of ears. And then after the fact, you can say, hey, isn't this interesting? This piece of software was able to cluster these in a smart way. And now I can use this cluster to be able to find all the future pictures of these things. By the way, that's how all these CAPTCHAs work. All of us are in this glorified mechanical Turk where people are saying, oh, we want you to do this CAPTCHA for security purposes to make sure it's a bot. In many cases, it's BS. We're training Teslas. We're training self-driving cars when we're finding where the intersection is and where the stoplights are and where the mountains are and the school buses are and where the motorcycles are, so on and so forth. We're part of the quote unquote AI to help train these models. We're labeling data.
Well, why don't we pivot from it? That was really helpful. Why don't we pivot to Dan? I think the next thing we were going to talk about, and I'll pivot over to you, Dan, is obviously there are a lot of concerns around the world, and just as a person that walks the earth, about the effect of these technologies and kind of the downsides of AI, machine learning, and neural networks. Why don't I pivot over to Dan to ask a few questions there?
Sure. So in the law, typically the playbook in the law right now is somewhat limited and based on a privacy self-management model where the idea is, well, the way we're going to regulate is to provide people with greater knowledge about what data is being gathered about them, and in some cases, like with the GDPR, it's to give you information about the logic used to make decisions about you, and then ultimately give people a choice. Typically, take it or leave it. The choices aren't very granular, and when they are, sometimes not necessarily that meaningful. But people get some kind of choice. But ultimately, one of the challenges here is that it's very challenging to give the consumer information here. Can you describe some of these difficulties when it comes to how do we keep a consumer informed about what is going on so that they can make meaningful choices about the use of these technologies?
Okay, that's a great question, but I have to say, most big tech companies don't inform consumers. They just don't. I'll give you a perfect example of a story that broke in the last week, where us as practitioners and as technologists, we know why certain features exist in messaging products. For instance, across all of the messaging platforms that I use, I have link previews off. And I've had it since I've downloaded and built accounts in there. And yet in the last week, somebody did a survey and said, holy smokes, as these things are previewing documents and as they're previewing websites that you're sharing with your family members, with your friends, with your coworkers, there's all this leakage of information and your private files that are being stored on Facebook, on Google servers, on Amazon servers, so on and so forth. Well, I knew why. Sure, there's a carrot that gets given whenever we add features for consumers. It's like, hey, wouldn't it be really convenient for you to get a preview of a document or a preview of of a news article before you go in there, so you have a sense of why a compatriot of yours is sharing something. But in reality, they're using that as yet another beacon that goes into their platform in order to infer something else about you. So I think it's nonsensical in some ways. We are not telling people why we're asking, why we're adding certain features. And many, I'm sorry, in the consumer space are snickering all day long that they got another data point, in order to sell smarter ads to folks. Or they say, oh, people can't handle the truth, or they can't handle, if we went in and documented all of these things, or maybe if they do document it, it's somewhere deep in the bowels of something that's not, human readable, or something that normal people would understand. And how many people actually go ahead and fact check? Maybe because I'm a boring person, in the middle of the night, if I don't do a sleep study, I'll go in once in a while and check all the settings of my phone and every app that I use. Hey, did something new show up? How many of you, when you update all the apps on your iPhone, if you even do update the apps on your iPhone with the latest security stuff, actually read all of the notes for every single iOS app for all the things that they changed, even in small point releases? I read every single one because I'm weird, but also I'm curious about how these systems are adapting, and then how people are disclosing these things. I know of certain massive breaches that haven't been disclosed yet in certain messaging platforms, and I'm staring at these app stores to see whether disclosing it, or are they just putting a little bullet point, bug fixes and feature enhancements, and they're not actually telling people that, hey, your data may have been compromised and is sitting overseas now.
So, yeah, I think one of the challenges is, it looks like, even though the law is trying really hard to make the consumer informed, companies just aren't informing consumers. But let's say even if they did, even if the information's out there, I mean, it's just too much for the average consumer to really start checking every single company they're doing business with, every single device, every single app, and then to actually understand it. I mean, you're able to understand it and really read it, and it's going to make sense to you. But for a lot of consumers, even if they can find the time magically to read all this, they're not going to understand it. And ultimately, that this is the California law, the CCPA gives people the right to get all the pieces of the data that is collected about them. But that's just telling people, like, basically they're going to see like a data dump. Look at that. There's a lot of data, and I learned that they have more data about me than I thought they did. But that ultimately just makes people know that one point. But it's kind of obvious to everybody in the field. But beyond that, to really make good cost-benefit decisions about, should I use this technology? What are the risks to me? What are the benefits to me? Is it worth it? What are the potential downstream harms? What should the what should the law do? I mean, is there a way that the law can play a role here that could be productive and helpful? What are your thoughts just generally on the role that the law has currently played, I guess, and then maybe the role that the law should play?
So I think, from a self-policing standpoint at an operating system level, certainly there's been consternation with a lot of app providers, because Apple's trying to be at the forefront of this, signaling at least the sharing that's happening, and what, beacons are being requested by, by applications of the device. And so Apple's at the forefront trying to figure some of these things out. From the law perspective, look, what most technology folks won't publicly express is as follows. They don't even know if these politicians can solve this for them, right? Or have any objectivity, because they'll always counter, right, the what about statement that they can't even keep water clean. They can't even keep the air clean. There are certain things that they can't do that are closer to the nitty gritty of our Maslow hierarchy of needs. And so how are they going to tackle something like this, where, frankly speaking, in some ways, it's going to be a cat and mouse games, right? So there's these big tech companies are always going to find, certain ways. So even if you say, hey, you can't capture certain types of data, the data will still stream through the platform, and then they'll figure out transfer learning. They'll figure out inferences. They'll figure out certain types of things where they can still know certain things. For instance, Dr. Nathan Agel of MIT did this research in eigenbehaviors, where knowing absolutely nothing about you other than all the places that you were going, he could predict that you would be one of 18 to 24 different demographic profiles automatically. At NSA, they were talking about where they don't even need to know the content of the communications, just the metadata of who are you communicating with at what time, in what place, was enough for them to infer, the types of activity that were transpiring across the network. And so even if you do try to gut it as best as you can, there's so many layers of metadata that get captured as we use these different systems that really big companies are going to know how to layer these things together so that even if they don't see the content, they can still know a lot about us, within a very reasonable approximation of who we really are.
So I might jump in here for a moment, Dan, with two quick things. One of the best things we have about these sessions is we actually do take questions from folks who are attending. So please post them in the comments, and Dan and I will raise them in the next couple of rounds. And if I could build on what we were just talking about. So let's shift for a minute from just what a company tells a consumer. Because setting aside AI, this is a pretty big problem right now that we've seen in a lot of ways, because it's not only about telling them what it is, telling people what is happening. There's so much information that you could put in a notice, it becomes overwhelming. So even if you just bombard people, it's too much information. A parallel challenge that is becoming part of privacy laws around the world, Igor, is using privacy laws like GDPR. It's certainly coming up in the discussions around the new California law, the CPRA, is the concept of regulating automated decision-making. And the concept here is, when you get to the point where there are decisions about your life, financing, how you get a house, how you get a loan, what is targeted to you, what is available to you, which school you go to, the more that a decision is now being made in an automated, algorithmic way, there are inherent biases present in that automated decision making that are impossible for a person to know are there. First of all, you might not know, as we just talked about, even that it's an automated decision or influenced by an algorithm. And two, once you even find that out, let's assume it's in the notice, you might not know what is influencing that algorithm inappropriately. And so the broad conversation that's going on regulatorily or in the privacy world is, even though there are laws that already prevent biased decisions, discrimination laws in various ways or broad discrimination laws, we need more specific laws in privacy to think about how AI, machine learning, neural networks should be regulated for consumer data, for personal data, because it's impossible to detect. I'll ask it in two ways of you. One, as a person who's doing business and actually understands this, do you see these kinds of automated decisions out there that bother you? And how do you think about this concept of regulating automated decision-making? If it's in a law, how's that possibly going to map to what's going on technologically?
Yeah, and part of so I'll build the case up from the device and then back into the network, back into the application. From the device, you hear edge-based computing, so air gapping things, right? Whether it's trying to do as much as possible locally, right? So that you can use all type of technologies possible, right? To maximize accuracy of whatever workflow you're doing, but to say, hey, it's disconnected and it's doing it just for you. In our case, right, from a cloud computing standpoint, we only service enterprises for the most part. And so our platform is essentially air gapped. So you don't have to use public cloud or the hyperscalers. Businesses can rely on us to run their workflows and not have any unintentional leaks of heuristics and things of that sort, especially if it's highly regulated industries. And then you're presenting a conundrum, right? So think of a healthcare use case, and I've mentioned this before when we have an AI and ethics debate. You know, in healthcare, look at all of the some of the AI that's being leveraged to find a therapy or a vaccine for COVID, right? What everybody's circumventing the normal process for drug discovery and for getting these things approved. Why? Because we're all running around like holy terror. Oh my God, we need to get this solved quickly so that we can get our economies, to stop sputtering and get them back into the fold and hire back as many folks as possible. And so, guess what? If it's a machine learning, deep learning approach that doesn't have explainability, it doesn't matter. People just want it to work, right? And so you have this case where you do want the explainability so that you can follow normal science, which is use facts to explain an outcome and its repeatability, and show people that there's no deviation and you're following a recipe. And then in some cases, if it's your family members that could be cured of cancer or COVID or whatever, based on, hey, just do the neural network thing and don't even know whether it's finding pictures of dogs and cats. We just want to see the outcome. You have that tension between these two opposing forces in many ways. And so I don't know how to solve that tension from a regulatory perspective in order to have that freedom of action, unless we say in regulated industries, you don't need explainability in a time of crisis, and then they're going to have to go in and give an executive order or otherwise that allows you to circumvent the normal pattern and practice that we expect out of a system.
One of the challenges, though, is that we're experiencing. I mean, there's sort of this. I think you captured very well. The benefits are very concrete and they're often very immediate. People want the benefits. The privacy concerns typically are more abstract. They're less immediate, and it's harder to really articulate them. And usually, it's harder to really understand the full extent of the harm until it's actually happened, until something occurs. But ultimately, what happens is there'll be something that goes wrong. A Cambridge Analytica type of event, and then there's a techlash. People get upset, they get angry. People generally feel uneasy about technology, which is why pretty much anything that Alistair McTaggart will put up on a referendum will probably pass. And so we'll get this kind of reflexive regulation. The regulators will be trying to catch up, but eventually they're going to do something and they'll enact something. And I guess ultimately there'll be a bit of a backlash. People get their immediate benefits, but then the problems come, and then they kind of lash out with regulation that could be perhaps counterproductive, that isn't balanced and really thought through all the issues. And I guess the thing is there a way out of this cycle? Is there a way to more in advance, try to figure out what should be disclosed? What should consumers know? Is it possible to tell them about this? Is it possible to identify what some of these problems are and create meaningful limits? Obviously, I hear your skepticism of, politicians can't seem to get anything right. They can't seem to be able to change a light bulb in Congress with all of them. But as an academic, I sit thinking about, what would, if politicians acted in good faith, actually really wanted to solve a problem, rather than, because a lot of times I don't think they do. But if they really did, what would that look like? Because, it's hard enough to get the politicians to want to solve a problem, but then if they actually do want to solve the problem, what's the answer? I'm not asking you for the answer so much as what are some of the directions that you might recommend we go in if we can't, fully tell the consumer, okay, what's going on here? How is this decision being made exactly? We might not fully understand it. What would you recommend? Do you have any thoughts on what things could perhaps be fruitful, directions that we would go?
So AI has been a secret part of our lives for a while now, right? Because you couldn't go shop on Amazon without AI underpinning their homepage. You couldn't go on YouTube without it underpinning the recommendations on the right side of what to watch next. You couldn't visit Facebook without it recommending certain things in the news feed, right? And we were hunky dory with that, and these were supporting ad-based businesses, or we were buying, consumer products, and for our households, until we figured out, holy smokes, these things actually transfer themselves into changing our physical world, right? And so now the techlash, as you described, is there were unintended consequences of having these technologies in front of these people, and look at what ended up happening as a result of it. I'll give you an important data point, which I think should wow most of you, make you feel good and also terrified at the same time. An average citizen has the same capability as an average CIA analyst had 30 years ago because of your access to social media, your Google Maps, all the news media that you want, all this open source discussions and things like that, videos that are at your disposal, and the fact that you can gather human intelligence from any corner of the world live streaming into social media or what have you. So if you're going, Justin, if you're going to a retirement party in Langley or anything else, and there's a veteran that's departing the agency, it's like an average soccer mom or student or any one of us has a lot more at their disposal than those people had when they started their career at the agency. Now, what's the difference between that individual who's retiring and us as normal people out there in the fold? The difference is they're trained to use that information. They know what's fake. They know what's not fake. They know what's being gamed. They know where they're being influenced. They know how to put these disparate pieces of information together into a cohesive report that they are accessing knowledge to drive a workflow, and then also to support decisions positively or negatively. They know that. And so, frankly speaking, before we repair a lot of this stuff, we actually even have to go into the primordial ooze and educate our up and coming citizens on what it means to have access to all of these things and how to be critical thinkers in this age of more, right? So that's step one. And then step two, as it comes here, this is why platforms like Wirewheel of critical importance. You don't even know what you have unless you know what you have. And so you need to inventory this stuff. And the fact that there's a non-conformity between the things that the companies know that they need or have versus what they actually have. And I'll give you a perfect example. So one of our production customers is Georgia Pacific, and they're using our AI for something that's interesting, safety related information. And so they threw a whole bunch of safety related information into our AI. They asked a question, and the wrong answer came out. The wrong answer came out of the AI, and they were thankful that the wrong answer came out. You know why? Because there was they put in a poison document into the AI, garbage in, garbage out. They would have never otherwise even known that document existed anywhere in there. And had any of their personnel use the information coming out of that document, it would have created a safety risk or even a risk of death had they leveraged that information.
Well, so that's what I love. So, to pivot, and we've had some questions along this line.
Mm-hmm.
There are both companies and technologies now that you can bring back to attack the same problem, right? So as much as we are distributing data in the cloud or distributing data into SaaS platforms or using APIs to really move data a lot more, with the right vision, you can actually use each one of those core technologies to tackle the privacy protective problem, right? What I love about what Wirewheel is doing with Prion is we're bringing that same view and the ability to understand your data, your systems, where it's moving through your technology in a partnership with Wirewheel. We're excited about this. But so I'll ask you, because it's come up several times in the questions that I'm seeing from the community today. Let's assume that you do have some actors out there that want to start doing the right thing. What is a company to do if they're using just any of the technologies to get this information out the right way? Number one. And number two, how can we take machine learning? How can we take the insights and analytics and view that you can bring with this technology and use it to actually protect people, even if they know it? You know, like, how can we bring that AI machine driven view so that companies that are trying to do the right thing can start operationalizing that way?
I think it gets to first inventorying and understanding how the system operates. Is it an end-to-end, fully machine-only process, or am I going to have to get called on Bloomberg to defend why certain people didn't disclose that there were human contact centers all over the globe, manually reviewing your sound files coming out of Siri, coming out of Facebook Messenger, coming out of Google Assistant, Alexa, or Cortana? They didn't disclose that was happening, or it was opt out. And then most people don't change default settings. So should opt out have been the normal default setting, right? Until you get that, though, people have to know. And you saw that in later iOS releases and later versions of these applications where they went, oops, let's default to everybody's opted out, and then let's put something in there as you start using this application to ask a question whether or not we can leverage this information this way in order to improve the system. So the first thing is knowing what you have, and then figuring out for these different workflows, what's automated, what's not automated, what's anonymized, what does that stuff mean, who gets access to it? Does only Wirewheel have access to this information, or do your partners have access to it? In my contracts last time, for the last startup, there are stipulations we can leverage some of the data for R&D purposes, but we couldn't market or resell any of that information. While privacy is this new thing that people go and sit in front of congressional hearings, there was no God mode in our company. Uber and Facebook and some of these other companies got caught with a God mode. We didn't have any. Do you know what? The types of people that I was hiring in my R&D team would have resigned had me as CEO ever asked for anybody's personal information because of the sensitivity of the content that we were processing. By the way, there was a company that recently had a breach in the millions, if not tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people were affected with voicemails, having been breached. So you have to do the right thing, and then you have to secure your platform from the hacker threat. And we didn't even talk about the hacker threat and how you have to disclose if there's issues that happen there. First thing is inventorying. How does it work? People need to be educated on how it works before they know how to police it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think that's where pairing the data about your systems and the information that you're collecting both from people and from the system with technology that's machine learning and AI driven, pairing the Wirewheel and Prion platforms, I think is going to be awesome over the time. Like, it takes time. You have to have enough data in the model, but you start to get some phenomenal views that are less driven by an ad hoc human eye, and I think that's where this becomes really important to actually operationalize this in the next few years. And as we get more standard data models and more information, I think there's some really, really powerful things that one can do to bring this machine learning driven view to some of the harder problems in understanding your own systems and privacy profiles. But so let me say this, we're at the 45-minute mark. Maybe Dan, you and I could ask one last question of Igor to kind of wrap it up today. This has been a phenomenal discussion, and I think terrific for our community, Igor. I do want to give you a chance to And I'll leave this at the end, maybe to talk about what you're doing at Prion and what you're bringing to enterprise next. But Dan, do you want to jump in on your final question, and I'll give one too?
Yeah, I guess sort of going back to, again, what can, smart legislation look like here? I ultimately have been very skeptical that, the average consumer can really, figure any of this out. They don't have time or the ability to really understand what is going on. And I think the other challenge too is that a lot of this is based not just on a particular consumer's data, but on a collective amount of data about a lot of different consumers, and then modeling based on that, and making decisions and learning based on the behavior in mass. And obviously then, to really understand, how is it or why is this decision made about me? Really, I'd have to see, all the data points going in, the logic of it, and then ultimately the evolution of of the inferences it's making to ultimately figure out. And there's just no way the average consumer is going to get that information, process it, or whatever. So what do you tell people? I mean, what should people know so that ultimately we avoid this cycle of techlash? Because what's going to happen is something comes out, oh my gosh, look at all the data it has, oh look at the decision it made, this is really creepy. So what and then there'll be a cool new thing that it does. Everyone's like, yay, we want it. And then it'll be, look at this creepy thing that it did, like, now we don't want it. What breaks us out of the cycle? What could we tell people? Or do we leave it to certain experts to mediate that information to people? Or is there a way?
So I'll get back to what I said before. You can operationalize a solution to that. You have to know what's there, and that's why I'm excited about platforms like Wirewheel, because I think we need the digital equivalent of what happens when we go to the supermarket and we pick up a product and we can see the nutritional information and the ingredient list of what it took to create that product. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of app developers are agitated at Apple is because they're starting to show the ingredient list in terms of how this thing works and where the information is going. And some of them don't want to know that, or they say, oh, people don't know how to tell protein from carbs, from sugars, or things like that. And that's always the excuse that normal people don't go. And I always say, reveal the information and then create educational programs to help people understand what these things mean. Once they know what's in the product, right, and the ingredients of it and how it works, then we can start figuring out, okay, now what outcomes do we want? Should we allow children to have access to a product that does this type of sharing? Should we allow the fact that we can control the type of recommendations that we want? So instead of it being some magical thing that happens at YouTube, that I say, hey, certain types of thinking or certain types of stuff that happens, I don't want any part of it. Or I don't want any recommendations, whatsoever. And so I think the first thing is what's in the product, and then we can start talking about, for different audiences, do we need to have to, segment these things out? And I think Wirewheel not only can help you, figure out the ingredient of what's there, the fact that businesses are highly dynamic. So they may be capturing certain things that they didn't even know about, and it's a surprise to some of these organizations. So I think that's a second thing. And then from a regulatory standpoint, I mean, there's going to be certain things that our societies expect in order to not affect, children in some ways, to not affect elections in certain ways. And I think you're going to see piecemeal solutions for certain types of influences. Now, I know social media is trying to police some of that through this election cycle for the types of ads that they're willing to take the week after the election, they're not going to have certain types of ads on election day or things like that. But there's going to be a lot more of that going forward.
Well, yeah. And so let me wrap up with this then, Igor. Tell us about Prion. Tell us what you're doing now. And you're doing some amazing things, as you and I have talked about. And I think bringing that kind of view and bringing this technology in a way that a lot of enterprises can really use is something we're excited about. So,
yeah. So like I said, Prion is named after the code name of the engine that became Alexa. So How is your experience at home different than your experience at work? Well, the average Fortune 1000 company has about 35,000 people. At home, we have what, less than a half dozen people that are using your Alexas and your Amazon Echoes. At work, you're going to have 35,000 people using that. So the first thing is you got a scale problem there. The next thing is accuracy, right? If this thing doesn't understand me, to turn on a light bulb, big deal. I'll walk over and press the button myself. But accuracy is required to perform enterprise workflows. Why? They're trying to run a business, right? And in some cases, very critical workflows. So accuracy expectations are heightened. The third thing is, at home, we generally buy into the homogeneous ecosystems that is the worldview of Apple, the worldview of Google, the worldview of Amazon. Whereas at work, these are heterogeneous environments that are bits and pieces of Oracle, of IBM, of Microsoft, of Salesforce, of SAP, so on and so forth. And you have this stuff that's a lot more fragmented. And then you have a security posture. At home, we're trusting, we have a one-to-one relationship with Apple, and we hope that they're defending us, or with Facebook, or with Google, or the rest of them. At work, this is an organization that has what? The 35,000 person company has 1 million customers, 10 million customers, 100 million companies, and they, have to ensure that they're defending the content and data. And so from their standpoint, they're like, we need an enterprise AI that's air-gapped, that we can control, that we can regulate with things like Wirewheel to make sure that the AIs are doing the things that they're supposed to be doing, no more and no less. Otherwise, we can't get insurance policies. Otherwise, we falter on our inbound and outbound threats and things of that sort. So it's a different type of problem. And I felt like there had to be a purpose-built enterprise AI company focused on those problems, that it wasn't going to be the consumer incarnations, and whether they're not trusted or they're not focused.
Well, look, I'll just tell you, I'm very excited about what you're doing. It's hard to bring this kind of enterprise grade AI-driven technology in the way that you have as a service. I'm excited about what you're going to do here in the next few years and our partnership between Prion and Wirewheel. I'll also, hey, thank you for teaching me how to speak Jablokov. I speak it with a cadence on one of these things. You and I can go back and forth with the cadence that you've taught me to make sure that I can work at home. For everybody out there today, I just first of all, on behalf of Dan and I, really want to thank you, Igor, for joining us. It's been an awesome discussion across a whole spectrum of issues, including just teaching us about the basic language, talking about some of the things we should be worried about, both in our jobs, but just as people interacting with companies. I've learned a lot today, and also thinking about how we can start taking these deeper technologies and using them to protect our own privacy, because I think it's going to have to go that way and be more conversational at some point in order to get people the right level of information. So on my part, thank you for joining us today. I'll turn it back over to Dan. Thanks for everybody joining us. And Dan, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Igor, for a great conversation. And we'll have a great afternoon. Take care.
Talk to you soon.
Thank you,
Igor.